Ready? Well, good morning. Thanks for being here. Great turnout for the Apocrypha. Hi to people who are watching on the live stream. We're just going to jump right in. So this is a 4-week series that I've designed to do, like what the title says, to explore the time between the Testaments. And we'll dig into why that's important, but it should be important because some of you have looked through the Older Testament this last year with Margaret and with me, and I think we can let this out of the bag. We're looking in the fall to start walking through the Newer Testament. So it's not a seamless transition from the older to the newer one. A lot happened and texts were produced, and so this might sound nerdy to some of you, which is why I'm so excited about it. But it's actually really important for understanding the Judaism into which Jesus was born, what life was like then, what people were worried about, what people were hoping for, and what they were reading, things like that. So here's my plan for the 4 weeks here, is that each week I want to introduce us to a group of ancient texts, different Jewish texts, and some of which you might have heard of before, a lot of which you might have never heard of before, and just kind of tell you what's out there and why they matter. But at the same time, I didn't want to just look at text, but I also wanted to consider a topic that is important for how we think about what the Bible is and why the Bible matters and helps us understand certain ancient societies. So today we're going to talk about the Apocrypha. I put that in quotes. We'll talk about what that word means and what's in the Apocrypha, and how that matters for thinking about the Bible. And I put back on the title slide, the Bible in quotes as well, because what the Bible is up for discussion depending upon who you are and what your community is, what church you're in, all those kinds of questions. So does that make sense? We're kind of going to look at some texts, but I also want to put them into a context and ask some big questions that I think matter for how we think about Scripture as a whole. Does that make sense? You in the right place? All right, good. That's what we're going to do. And here's a picture of Daniel feeding little balls of pitch and what else is in there? I think hair and fat to a dragon, which is in the Apocrypha. How about that? So that's what we're going to do. But to talk about the Bible in general, I thought we'd start with the news. Perhaps you heard about this, that a couple of days ago, the Louisiana legislature and then the governor signed into law a bill to require all public classrooms to display the 10 Commandments, which is an interesting law for a whole sort of reasons, and we're not going to go too deep into this. But the question that came to my mind is, who's going to decide what the 10 Commandments are? I have not dug into this. I have not read the legislation. I don't know if it's aware of this, but there's debate about what the 10 Commandments even are. Are we going to pull from Exodus chapter 20, or are we going to pull from Deuteronomy chapter 5? There's two different versions of the 10 Commandments. They're both generally the same, but there is some difference in wording and the rationale behind certain commandments. So that's interesting. The other question is, how will they be arranged into 10? I don't know if you know this or not, but depending upon the church you grew up in or if you've ever studied this, different traditions order the 10 Commandments differently. So these are not, the exact commandments. This was my way of trying to fit them all quickly onto a slide. But you'll notice there's more than 10 lines, beginning with, I am the Lord your God. And then you've got a series of imperatives, right? Things that you are being commanded to do. This looks confusing, but don't worry, I'll walk you through it. In Jewish communities, they take that first line, I am the Lord your God, as the first commandment. They actually don't even call them the 10 Commandments, they call them the 10 words in Jewish communities. Reformed, that's us. Presbyterians fall under Reformed. You've got Lutheran there on the right. We could make more columns, too, for Roman Catholics and some other groups. But just to note that Jewish communities do that, and then, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall make no graven images. Jews combine those, or see those as one single commandment. That's their second word. In the Reformed tradition, we take, I am the Lord your God, as a kind of preface, and then we go, no other gods, don't make graven images, and you can see all the way down. At the very bottom there, you've got language about coveting, and I'm going by memory here, but it's basically, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's wife, interesting, or your neighbor's ass. That'll be fun to put that on the public school classroom walls. Or your neighbor's slave, which is also really fascinating. That as the Louisiana legislature is thinking about putting these into classrooms, how are you going to put all that into context, right? Don't covet your neighbor's house, wife, ass, or slave. Anyway, in Jewish and in Reformed traditions, we take those as a single commandment, kind of all under the coveting commandment. In the Lutheran tradition, they see those, primarily, this is following Luther's ordering, as two separate commandments, two separate coveting commandments. And then to make up for that, Luther saw no other gods before me and graven images as both kind of part of a single commandment. Why does this matter? It's just to say it's not immediately clear from the text how you should order these. Somebody's got to make posters in Louisiana at the end of the day and put them up, right? So my point about all of that is whose Bible and whose tradition is going to be used at the end of the day. I have a guess what Bible, what tradition they're going to use, but that's just me. And the other question, too, is this whole thing isn't really even about the Bible, I don't think. I think this has to do with some other kinds of political posturing, and the Bible's being used to prop up something. But that's for another class. But just to kind of point out that the Bible is not necessarily a utterly clear, singular thing that fell out of heaven one day and is perfectly ordered, right? So what? The Bible is more fluid than we usually imagine. Right? What counts as the books of the Bible? It depends on your tradition. How do you deal with certain confusing parts of the Bible? Who gets to translate the Bible, right? A lot of meaning goes into that. If any of you know more than one language, if any of you have ever worked as a translator, you know that a translator interprets as they go. You can't just, you can plug it into a system, but it's going to look like an AI-generated translation, at least until 2025. We'll see how that goes, right? But translators have tremendous power over this, and we don't have, I should have brought my Greek Bible, the Bibles that we collect in Hebrew and in Greek, looking at old texts, those are all collections of a variety of fragments and manuscripts. You know what I mean? We don't have a single book from the first century that says the Bible on it or the Newer Testament on it, right? This is the work of people, smart people, hardworking people, who are trying to reconstruct what these original old ancient texts would have looked like. So when we talk about the Bible, we have to be really clear whose Bible are we talking about. Maybe you've been to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. This is funded by the I forget their name, the Hobby Lobby family, but it's one of the criticisms of this is it's their understanding of what the Bible is very Protestant, right? That there's very little recognition that Jews have a Bible as well, and Roman Catholics' understanding of the Bible might be different. Same with Orthodox communities. So the Bible is a bit of a construct in Christian life, I'd say in Jewish life too. And what I mean by that more fluid, is that religious communities are always making decisions about what it contains and how to read it. The idea about what it contains is kind of closed. Most Christian churches have agreed, we're not going to change that. We've been working with this for many centuries, and it seemed to work for a lot of people so far, although some people would argue back against that, and those are really good conversations to have. But also how to read it. Like, what's the right way to read this? A lot of people claim that every single word in the Bible is important to them. Nobody really lives that way, right? We all have favorite passages. We all have favorite books. We all have parts that we kind of wish weren't there, but, as long as we don't spend too much time on them, we'll be happy. We all have a way of organizing this book to make it make sense. What do I mean by that? Well, if you believe that God is loving versus if you believe God is vindictive, well, it kind of depends. Which passages are you choosing as your foundations or as your starting points to make those decisions? Religious communities are always doing that with our sacred texts. There's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just a reminder that there always is a human element and in some ways a decision-making element in how we talk about the Bible. So then what is the Christian Bible? This question maybe undermines everything I just said. What is the Christian Bible? In some ways, this is not a super difficult question, right? The Older Testament, check. Everybody agrees. There's 39 books. When I say everybody, I'm talking Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox communities. By and large, most Christian traditions adhere to these 39 books, which are the exact same 39 books that, different number. The exact same books that the Jewish communities read as what they call Tanakh, right? Their Holy Scripture, or the Hebrew Bible, as it sometimes is called. The Newer Testament, again, check, 27 books. All Christian communities agree these are the 27 that we should read. Again, obviously there's some Christian communities out there that might not. For the most part, 99.5% of Christian communities in the world have generally agreed to read these books. However, most Christians around the globe and throughout history have included more books in their understanding of what the Bible is. And I say this because there's a lot of Roman Catholics in the world. There's a lot of Eastern Orthodox Christians in the world. In the United States, we sometimes just imagine that Protestants are it, right? And we all have a few Catholic friends, and maybe you've driven by an Orthodox church one day, but a lot of us don't have a lot of connection to those communities. At least I don't on a regular basis, probably because I work at a Lutheran seminary and at a Presbyterian church. But this reminder, right, that people have read other books. And that's our topic for today. I got here early. I was going to put, we've got some study Bibles back there. I was going to put one or two on each table so you could look at these other books. And lo and behold, they're not included. We have Protestant Bibles back there on the cart, right? Which is fine. We're Protestants, but it's really interesting. So Joey, where'd Joey go? Joey's in here. There she is. Joey was going to have to go to the library and found a study Bible that actually includes the other books. So it's not like these are hidden books or bad books. Your hands won't catch on fire if you read them or anything like that. I brought my own as well that has these other books that I'm going to talk about today. Makes sense where we are right now? This is all big. We're flying at 35, 40,000 feet right now. So what are these other books then? First of all, what do we even call them is a great question. In Roman Catholic traditions, they call them the deuterocanonical books. That's a fun word to say and to spell. And in Protestant circles, they're often referred to as the Apocrypha. I'll say more about those names in just a moment. But here are the books. These are books that Roman Catholics include as these books between the Testaments. And I'll come back to this list in a minute, so the slide will come back, is my point. Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, another fun word to say and to spell. Communities consider scriptural. In other words, it's got these deuterocanonical books that the Roman Catholics read. It also has books that Orthodox communities read, like the Prayer of Manasseh and Third Maccabees and Fourth Maccabees. In other words, the editors decided, let's make this a Bible that's good for all Christians. Every Christian community can find what they want in here. But the irony of it is, there is no Christian community that I know of that reads this exact book as the Bible. You know what I mean? It all has extra stuff for everybody, which is kind of interesting, right? The challenge of creating a book that all Christians can say, yes, my scriptures are in there, still require you to have other writings. None of these writings are necessarily scandalous or bad or teach anything like really opposite from what you've been taught. We'll explain kind of what makes them weird or why Christians have fought over them in just a second. Anybody read any of these? Anybody have any background with any of these, perhaps? A couple? All right. If you're wondering which one should I read first, the short answer is Tobit by far, which is a bit of a hoot. We'll talk more about Tobit in a minute. If you want to read one that's really funny, Bell and the Dragon, I think. If you want to read one that's really depressing, Second Maccabees. So anyway, just because it's so violent, it's just about a revolt and about torture and horrible things that people underwent. So here's the question: where do these books come from then? Like these books, like where do they originally come from? I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But just to note, they all predate Jesus. These are all Jewish books, right? Back before the time Jesus was born. But if you remember, if you were part of the series during this last year, almost all of the Older Testament was written down at least 300, maybe even 400 years prior to Jesus. There are a couple of books that we think are later, books like Daniel, for example. But for the most part, by and large, most of the Older Testament is not only before Jesus, but generations and generations, right? I think at least 4 centuries prior to Jesus. There's one of these books, The Wisdom of Solomon, might be written around the same time as Jesus. There's debates about that, but for the most part, they predate Jesus. Who first gave them high regard? Like, who first read these books and said, yeah, these are better than other things, right? We should read these in our religious communities. And the answer to that is first, Jews did, as far as we can tell, based on where these books are found, what other books they are collected with. Do you know what I mean? They appear within collections of writings like Genesis and Isaiah and things like that. It appears that there were Jewish communities in the centuries prior to Jesus who thought these books were useful for teaching and maybe for worship and just understanding who they were. Later, Christians took on these books as well. There was no such thing as the Bible when Jesus was alive. No such thing as the Bible when Jesus was alive. In other words, nobody had made a decision, no Jewish communities had made a decision, these are the books that are in, and those are the books that are out. Does that make sense? Jesus does talk often, in fact, other New Testament authors too, about the law and the prophets. And you might remember from last year, the law are the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The prophets is a significant chunk of the Older Testament. It appears that there were plenty of Jews in the first century that were reading the law and the prophets and the Psalms as well as like authoritative books, right? As books worthy of respect and honor and for religious instruction. But it wasn't until a couple of centuries after Jesus that Jews finally said, okay, these are our books, we've chosen them, we're done. Does that make sense? So there were books that were considered authoritative or scriptural or important, but there wasn't a defined Bible. When I say the Bible, I mean, what are you finally going to publish? Right? What are you going to put in the document? What are you going to leave out of the document? So Christians, first generations of Christians, don't have a specific Bible, but they do have all of these texts that Jesus knew and taught about, and Paul knew and taught about, and other New Testament authors knew and taught about. And so these Jewish texts became really important for Christians. And one of the things we'll see next year is the way in which Christian authors, Newer Testament authors, are using Older Testament writings to help them make sense of who Jesus was. In other words, they didn't say, let's get a whole new Bible, let's throw out all this Jewish writing, but it was seen as consistent. So you've got both Jews and Christians in 2nd century, 100 years after Jesus and going forward, who are all reading these books and giving them high regard. The problem is, the books are all written in Greek, and in some cases other languages. But the way people are reading these books in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century is in Greek. The Older Testament, you might remember, is written in Hebrew and a little bit in Aramaic, which is a similar language to Hebrew. So the books themselves not only come from a certain time, but they reflect a certain kind of cultural influence, right? They're written in Greek. And one of the things that happens in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, this is when the church and the synagogue are moving farther apart and in fact are directing quite a lot of hostility toward each other. I mean, the roots of modern anti-Semitism really lie in late 1st, 2nd century, 3rd century hostilities. What starts happening there is Jewish communities are saying, these Christians are reading our scriptures and they're reading them in Greek, and we really don't like the conclusions that they're reaching. Let's go back to Hebrew. In other words, there's this kind of movement back to a kind of a more traditional, is not quite the right thing, but kind of a back to the sources, kind of a back to the source language among Jewish communities. And once they do that, they start to push away these Greek books, like the ones that we're going to look at in a minute. Does that make sense? Christians are like, we're happy to read these books. This is great. Yeah, sure, we'll keep reading them. I mean, there's a debate here about who's reading the right books. Jews are saying you have to read them in Hebrew. Christians are like, you can read them in Greek. That's absolutely fine. So what happened later then is just Christians start reading the books, right? For the most part, Jews start to reject them in the 2nd and 3rd century. Not saying they're bad books, but just saying these aren't part of our scriptures, because they're creating a Bible at this point as well as Christians are. Some Christians are reading them. So you might have heard of the name Jerome. Saint Jerome lives around the year 400. and he's a language expert, and he's the one who's responsible for first translating the whole Bible into Latin. He translates the Bible, he and his students translate the Bible into Latin. And in the Western Church, at least, which is what became the Roman Catholic Church and later the Protestant Church, that Latin Bible was the Bible for well over 1,000 years and even still on. Jerome is one of the few Christian writers of this time who actually knows Jews, right? Who actually, instead of like writing hostile things about Jews, is actually hanging out with rabbis and learning from them and debating with them. And this seems to affect Jerome's position on these books. And Jerome's like, why should Christians be seeing these books as scriptural if Jews are not? And in some ways, he's resistant to including these books in his translation of the Bible. Does that make sense? I mean, the Catholic Church basically commissions him, translate the scriptures into Latin. You're going to become the definitive translation. It becomes known as the Vulgate if you've got Catholic roots in you. Jerome writes about these books and says he's not sure about a lot of them. He thinks they're a little not quite right in terms of what they say. He translates a few of them, but then after he dies, the church has some of his students translate all of them and include them in the Bible, right? Kind of going against Jerome's maybe better inclinations in that. So for the most part, these are part of the Bible throughout all the Middle Ages. The Bible's in Latin. Most people aren't able to understand it. The clergy knows Latin. Then the Protestant Reformation comes along. You might have heard of it. We've now jumped into the 16th century, covering all of Western history today. And in 1534, Martin Luther translates the Bible into German, right? A significant move. And he does this not by copying out of the Latin, but I believe he's actually going back to Hebrew and to Greek texts and going straight into German. And what Luther does is he does not include these books that we've talked about. And he refers to them as the Apocrypha. He's not the first person to use that word. It's been kind of part of Christian tradition talking about these books. But Apocrypha is simply a Greek word that means hidden. So he refers to them as hidden books. And what he means by that isn't that they're like unable to be found, but he means we don't really know where they came from. We're not exactly sure who wrote them. Some of them appear to have been originally written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek, right? Because the Greek kind of matches Hebrew syntax. And he's like, we're just kind of not sure where they came from. We're not quite sure who might have written them. And we're not exactly sure about the contents, if they're like Orthodox. And so he still translates them, still thinks that they're worth reading, but kind of puts them on a lower level than what he would call Holy Scripture. Does that make sense? And gives them that name Apocrypha, which is a little bit of a condescending term for it, right? These are these mysterious books. These are these slightly untrustworthy. These are these shadowy books. That makes sense? In the Reformed tradition, Calvin and others kind of follow suit. I've heard this, I've not been able to look this up, but one of the problems Luther had with these books is there are some parts of them were the basis for the Roman Catholic kind of understanding of purgatory. And so Luther was like, let's just not let people read these, because Luther was not big on purgatory for a number of reasons. So part of what's going on is the battles of the Protestant Reformation, right? Some of this started with battles between Christians and Jews in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, right? Do we include these? Do we not include these? And then the battle kind of re-ups now between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th century. The Roman Catholic Church has, in response to Luther in particular and other reformers, has a long-running council called the Council of Trent in the years 1545 to 1563, where they kind of reassert, quote-unquote, traditional Catholic doctrine over against the Protestants. And one of the things they do is they say, oh, and by the way, these books are Scripture. And they call them deuterocanonical books, which is a fancy way of saying canonized second. So there's kind of this recognition that these books aren't exactly the same as the other biblical books, but they still have this canonical value. There's not a huge debate about whether their theology is kosher or not. It's kind of this Catholic Protestant pushing back and forth. That's a big part of this. Does that make sense? So these have books that have been fought over for reasons beyond what they say, but kind of who likes them, right? And what the theological and political battles of the day might be. That makes sense? That's kind of the history of them. And I want to go back to where they originally come from. I also recognize we have a severed head on the slide, which I haven't bothered to talk about at all. It's kind of in the shadows there. This is a depiction of Judith in the book of Judith. Perhaps you've seen images of Judith holding a severed head. You might have thought it was John the Baptist, but no, before John, there was an Assyrian general named Holofernes who Judith beheads, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But there's going to be some images of beheadings, and yeah, that's her maidservant who puts the head into a basket so they can sneak it away from the Assyrians. So anyway, there's Judith for you. More on her in a moment. Questions? We've covered, about 2,000 years of history in probably 30 minutes. And we've got a microphone for folks online and the video. Ken's going to shuttle that around. We'll get into what these books actually say and what's interesting about them in a moment, trust me.
So this might be going down an alleyway, but does the Quran have the 10 Commandments?
Does the Quran have the 10 Commandments? I don't think it does. If Mustafa were here, he would know right away, but I don't believe it does. In the front, Dwayne's here. Got his hand up.
You've been giving us this history in terms of the differences of what is written. Is there also differences in terms of what isn't written? And I remember something, especially in my catechism, the difference between Protestants and Catholics was Catholics had tradition, oral tradition, accompanying the scriptural tradition. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So is that part of all of this?
It's partly the... in the Catholic Church in the 16th century, for the most part, there were two sources of authority. There's scripture and there's tradition, or there's the church hierarchy. And these are seen as kind of mutually interpreting. And so one of the reasons the Catholic Church is in no hurry to translate the Bible out of Latin is because then people might read it, right? And they might decide for themselves what it means apart from a church structure. Is that true Jewish and Christian early on? That's a great question. Yeah, so there is a movement in the 2nd and 3rd century among Jews to go back to Hebrew. Because for the most part, they're all speaking Greek. And this is mostly among kind of learned Jews who are now saying, if you want to read the Bible, you have to read it in Hebrew. So there is that going on in Judaism as well in the 3rd and 4th century. Nowadays, of course, Jews translate their Bibles into English. Roman Catholics will as well, right? So these are old battles in some ways. But it does have to do with who gets to decide who gets to read what, always, right? Ken, and then Mark in the front.
The Jewish community, when did they actually and how did they canonize their scriptures?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the time of Jesus, like I said, there was no the Bible, although most Jewish groups, not all of them, are reading the law and the prophets, which is a significant section of it. They're still working out questions about books like Song of Solomon and some other books like that. But it's basically during the 2nd and into the 3rd century of the Common Era. And what happens is, more history. The Jerusalem temple is destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 after a revolt, which is catastrophic for Jewish self-understanding at the time. In the year 135, the Romans put down a second revolt, and as a result of that, they expel all Jews from Jerusalem. They change the name of the city. They build a temple to Jupiter, where the Jerusalem temple was. And so kind of the Jewish scribal intellectual elite is now essentially exiled into Galilee. And there they go about the work of collecting texts, training up-and-coming rabbis in Hebrew, and kind of making these decisions about what is and is not. It wasn't like there was a council, but it was as a result of that movement, which is an incredibly robust kind of intellectual period in the making of what we now call Rabbinic Judaism. See, we're talking about a period here in the first, second, third century where Christianity is emerging out of Judaism, first within and then out of Judaism. Judaism itself is changing because there's no longer a temple, there's no longer a priesthood. Connections to land have become very tenuous, and so they're kind of learning to be a people now following Torah and seeing Torah obedience as the prime marker of Jewish identity, which of course is what continues today. There are very few Jews in the world today who want to rebuild a temple and conduct sacrifices. Does that make sense? So it's one of the reasons why I think we need to talk about Judaism and Christianity today as sibling religions, that we really both are coming out of a similar ground that fell apart under everybody's feet, right? For Jews with the loss of the temple and the loss of land, and for Christians with Jesus didn't come back when we thought he would come back, and a lot of Jews didn't turn and follow Jesus as Messiah, and now we're this Gentile church. You know what I mean? That both are trying to come to self-definition. And texts matter tremendously for self-definition, right? What are our texts? What are the things that tell us who we are and who gets to interpret them? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, Matt, you've already answered a lot of my question, but to just extend it a little bit, there were Jews living throughout the ancient world by the time we're talking about, some of them very smart, many of them writing about theological or philosophical topics, and yet those don't even get considered to be kicked out. How was that decided? Was it just a matter of not knowing about them, or was it a sort of priestly elite that said, we're not even going to consider these?
Yeah, I think some of that has to do with the distinction among some of these Jewish teachers of what's old and what's written versus what is interpretation of that. And so it's like some of these writings are interpreted, like you and I've talked about Philo before, who's a Jewish thinker who lives in Egypt. And a lot of his writings are interpretations of books like Genesis, for example. And so that is seen as more kind of commentary or like second level. Even in Jewish's day, you've got Jewish teachers who are distinguishing between what they would call written Torah, the actual book, the laws themselves, and what they would call oral Torah, which is interpretation, right? It's what happens when people gather and they say, how should we order the 10 Commandments? Or what does it mean to keep the Sabbath day holy? And so I think with some of like Jewish philosophers, those were seen as more like in conversation with the interpreters. You know what I mean? So not at the level. They might be good, they might be worth reading, they might be instructive, they might be orthodox, but they don't quite rise to the level of like, what should you actually read in the synagogue on a given Sabbath or something like that. Does that make sense? Even in Christianity, goodness, next summer we could do the time after the Newer Testament and read Christian literature that was not included in the Newer Testament, but Christians were reading. They just didn't think, or at least the leaders didn't think, they should be read like from the pulpit on Sunday morning. You know what I mean? That distinction. All right, one more, and then we're going to move on. No, it's all good.
Maybe I just missed this, but what is the difference between the Tanakh and the Torah?
Good question. So Tanakh is the Hebrew term for their scriptures. And it just comes TNK, those letters, T for Torah, N for Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophets, and Ketuvim, the K, which is the Hebrew word for writing. So it's just basically what's it called, an anagram? I always get that confused with an anachronism. An anagram, TNK, so it's Torah, prophets, writings. So that's their whole Bible. That's the whole Hebrew Bible. Torah is just the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. All right, good. So where did these books come from? Where in time, where in place? And for this, we have to go back to an old favorite slide of mine, the timeline. Oh, good. People who are new are like, what in the world is that? This is a timeline that Margaret and I got a lot of mileage out of this last year. It basically starts about 1,000 years prior to Jesus with Saul and David and Solomon, a divided kingdom. But you might remember where it says here, Cyrus of Persia allows deported Jews to return. This is the beginning of the Persian Empire. This is when exiled Jews go back to Jerusalem, and they're still writing. This is when a lot of the literary generativity of Older Testament texts happens. So early 6th century into the 5th century BCE, before the Common Era, prior to Jesus. But you also get here this, what I call, we talked a bit about Second Temple Judaism. They rebuild the temple. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, so it's rebuilt. And that kind of launches new ways, new understandings of what does it mean to be Jewish. Why? Well, who are the priests? How do you figure out who the priests are after the priesthood was largely wiped out by the Babylonians, right? So things like genealogies become very important. Can you prove your priestly lineage? Who gets to rule? Who gets to decide who gets to marry whom, right? Remember Margaret talked about Ezra and Nehemiah if you have a great photographic memory. But what you need to know in that green period is this, that around the year 332, it's the rise of a new empire. It's the Hellenistic Empire, or the Greek Empire, led by Alexander the Great, if you're familiar with Alexander, who starts in Macedonia and goes east and gets Egypt, gets what we now call Palestine, Israel, goes as far east as modern India, just brings an incredible amount of land under his control. Alexander's vision for running an empire is not about exiling people. It's about propagating Greek culture wherever he goes. You can keep your religion, you can keep all of your commerce, make sure the taxes keep flowing, but we want you all to learn Greek, and we want you all to have these Greek-styled schools. Hey, here's some Greek philosophy. You might want to read this. Here's some Greek architecture. You might want to design your buildings. It's worked really well for us. In other words, he Greekifies, to use a word, or he Hellenizes a huge part of the world. So what happens as a result of this, Jews who, and Mark mentioned they're spread out all over. There's, at the time of Jesus, more Jews are living outside of Palestine, Israel, than are living within it. Because it's safe, right? You've got an empire that's making commerce and travel safe and easy. You've got Jewish communities popping up all over, and they're all speaking Greek, for the most part, except maybe the most traditional separatists. We'll meet some of them next Sunday. They're largely speaking Greek, and so what happens then is you've got the Bible, or at least these scriptural texts, there's no the Bible, but scriptural texts are getting translated into Greek because that's what people are reading. That's what people are teaching their children to speak. And you've also got people now writing new texts in Greek as they go. And so where these books come from is out of that period where Jewish authors are composing in Greek, or Jewish authors or translators are translating some Hebrew texts or Aramaic texts into Greek. Does that make sense? So everybody knows at the time of Jesus that Genesis was originally written in Hebrew. Maybe not everybody can read Hebrew, but they know it was originally written in Hebrew, and you might know a rabbi somewhere who knows some Hebrew, and that's all great. But there are also these other Jewish texts that are in Greek. Why is this important, or why should you care about any of this? It's because at this time it's this reminder that Second Temple Judaism, or the Judaism of the 3 centuries prior to Jesus, I'm going to say this every single Sunday for the next 4 weeks, just so get ready, was not the same thing as ancient Israelite religion. In other words, Judaism is developing, right? It's adapting, it's changing, and part of that is linguistic, part of that is cultural. You're speaking Greek, you're now in conversation with other people who are speaking Greek. The Greeks have a great philosophical, religious tradition. You've got Egyptians who know Greek who are able to talk to you about Egyptian philosophy and Egyptian religion. Do you see what I mean? It's interacting with its neighbors, and it's changing. We read the Older Testament and we see things like, well, this is how this was celebrated, or this is, you're not allowed to marry foreigners or something like that. This must have been the law. No, it's changing, right? And so centuries prior to Jesus, Jews are changing the way they practice their religion. Just like I'm sure life at Westminster today is different than it was 120 years ago. I hope. No offense to back then, but I mean, things have changed. We know our neighbors differently. The way we think is different. Our notion of who God is probably slightly different. There's nothing wrong with religions changing, he said, hoping there's no Orthodox here in the room. I would say there's nothing wrong with religions changing. They do it all the time. The other thing we need to know about this time is that Judaism is tremendously diverse in geography, as far away as Rome, far to the east as well, towards India. It's also diverse in its ethnicity. You've got Jewish groups in Africa who are darker skinned than the Jewish groups who are in the northern Mediterranean. And you have diverse practices. Not everybody is practicing Judaism in exactly the same way. Just like today, if the news were to walk in here and say, what do Christians think about, I don't know, the law in Louisiana? We would say, well, it depends which Christians you're talking to, right? There is no the Christian point of view in America today. And there was no the Jewish point of view in Judaism at this time. So we should expect to see some diversity, right? Some differences in thought, different ways in which people are borrowing from their neighbors. It's an incredibly interesting and productive time to be Jewish in these centuries. So, of course, when Jesus comes, right, people want to ask him what he thinks about certain things: Sabbath observance, dietary laws, divorce, right? What's your point of view on the issues of the day? Jesus is born into a time of tremendous dialogue. All right, we should talk about these books briefly, right? Finally, any burning questions, or can we move on to this? All right. So notice the change. So here are the books, right? What's going on in these books? Tobit, big debates. This is maybe about 300 years prior to Jesus. It's very, very legendary, very moralistic in its tone. But Tobit is this righteous man who spends his free time burying the dead during a war, right? Somebody who's just has great concern for his neighbors, great concern for the land, great concern for righteousness. At the same time, he suffers greatly. And this is where the root of his suffering is here, early in the book, where he says, that same night I washed myself and went into my courtyard and lay down by the wall of the courtyard. My face was uncovered because of the heat. I did not know that there were sparrows on the wall. Their fresh droppings fell into my eyes and produced white films. I went to physicians to be healed, but the more they treated me with ointments, the more my vision was obscured by the white films until I became completely blind. So he suffered. I mean, it's kind of funny, too. I told you this is very kind of legendary and humorous in the story. So Tobit is blind in the book. But when you see Tobit in art, he's often accompanied by a dog, which I love. There are references to dogs in the Bible in a few places, almost always negative, as dogs as scavengers or just unclean animals. But in Tobit, there's a dog that appears to be a pet, which I love. So I don't think there's any cats in the Bible, but there are dogs in the Bible. And you might see outside the door, there's like a guy with wings riding a horse. So there's an angel who's also, Raphael the angel is in this. You don't see a lot of stories about angels. You see some in the Older Testament, but not a lot. So you've got Tobit, who's accompanied by a dog. He's accompanied by an angel. And eventually this angel, I'm going to skip over this because it's long, but this angel, Tobit's in a river and a fish attacks him and tries to eat his leg. And so the angel's like, throw it on the land. They get it in the land, and the angel instructs him to like cut out its heart and its gall and all these organs. And he says, you're going to need these for later. And what happens is there's a woman in the story named Sarah who has been married 7 times, and each time her husband has died on their wedding night. And it's kind of like, what's going on? And it turns out there's a demon that's in love with her that's killing these husbands. And so they have to exorcise the demon. And so the angel instructs Tobit, put the fish liver and the fish heart on this fire, and the smell will drive the demon away. So it's, like I said, very kind of legendary. And eventually his son Tobias marries Sarah. But you've got this idea of the importance of being healed from blindness, but you've also got this idea that there are demons in the world that are harassing individuals, which is not a topic you see in the Older Testament, but of course it's all over the place in the Gospels. So we see some changes here, this understanding of what if there are these spiritual powers out there who do real harm to people, and how do you get rid of them? And the answer for Tobit is you got to know the right fish liver, and you need an angel to help you out. And so it's fascinating when Jesus comes along then and just does what? Just commands them to leave, right? With no spell, no incantation, no props, things like that. Judith, another fun story, it's set in the 6th century. It's probably written closer to the 1st century. But Judith she's a widow and she's in mourning. And meanwhile, her village is under assault by the Assyrian Empire. And Judith decides she's had enough. The rulers of the city are making plans to hand the city over to the Assyrians. So she just kind of gives a speech and talks about how unfaithful they are and how terrible they are. And then she changes her clothing, and we're told she's very beautiful, makes herself beautiful, and she says, I'm going to do something now. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because you're going to mess it up. And so she goes off with her maidservant and is captured by sentries from the Assyrians who are like, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm a Hebrew. I'm running from the city because they're going to hand it over. Bring me to Holofernes, your general. I'm going to tell him how he can take the city secretly and not lose any men in battle." I'm like, oh, this is great. And they're all captivated by her beauty. Everybody's like, she's so beautiful. We've got to bring her to Holofernes. Holofernes, of course, falls in love with her. She finds a way to get into his tent at night. He passes out drunk, and then you get this really brutal story of how she cuts off his head with her sword in just 2 swings, and then hides the head, is able to sneak out with her maidservant, brings it back to her village, and of course does what? Shows everybody the head, right? And Judith is then praised, and she's wonderful. And so it's this interesting story of a powerful woman, but who also is able to manipulate men who can't see past her beauty. So it's an interesting story in terms of how gender works in this. I'm going to skip over this text. Do you want to see more severed heads? Or no? I mean, there's really no choice. You see a lot of this in medieval art. It's part of this is Judith is kind of in the lineage. If you remember Deborah from the book of Judges, or Yael or Jael as well, who drives a tent peg through the temple of a military commander. But Kehinde Wiley, who you might know from he did the portraiture of the Obamas as well, did a couple of Judith images that raised a bit of a scandal. Because in both cases, it's not Holofernes, but it's a white woman's head that she's waving around. And Wiley's point of this is about women breaking free, black women breaking free from the standards of beauty that are largely based around white women's beauty and how that gets put into the media. But anyway, interesting image, right, of women holding severed heads. Blame Judith for that, or credit Judith for that, depending upon your point of view. Additions to Esther, the book of Esther was expanded when it was translated into Greek, and God was given more credit for what took place in that. Wisdom of Solomon, I talked about this a little bit when we talked about wisdom literature. This is a book that praises wisdom, Jewish wisdom. It also talks about how the soul lives on after death, which is not a topic you see a lot in the Older Testament. In fact, I think only the book of Daniel talks about an afterlife as we understand that today, and that's probably written about 150 years prior to Jesus. So here you have another Jewish text that's talking about the soul's existence. Who else believes in the existence of a soul? Ancient Greeks, for sure, right? So we see ways in which Judaism is thinking, well, if God is really powerful, why couldn't God raise somebody from the dead? Why couldn't there be a life beyond this one? And then Jews are seeing in their own scriptures places that might bear witness to that, bear testimony to that. Oh, goodness. Oh, I see what I did there. Sorry. Ecclesiasticus, this is also known as Ben Sira, or Son of Sirach, another book that's very much about wisdom teaching as well. Interesting, this author appears to be familiar with a range of other literature, Old Testament texts, also some other Jewish texts, and even some Greek texts that he appears to be referring to. So you get this idea of a Jewish scholar. Baruch, if you remember Baruch in the Older Testament, he was Jeremiah's scribe. So this purports to be a letter that Baruch wrote from Babylon in exile to the people of Jerusalem. But it's a later document than that. It's almost certainly written in the 2nd century prior to Jesus. You've got a letter from Jeremiah where he's writing from Jerusalem to exiles in Babylon. So what we get here is interesting. In Baruch and in the letter of Jeremiah, you've got Jewish authors who are trying to fill in some of the gaps in the book of Jeremiah. If you remember Jeremiah, he's writing as people are being brought into exile, and he's trying to encourage people that they're going to be okay in exile. But Jeremiah himself is smuggled off to Egypt, right? He escapes exile. But here's ways in which authors are thinking, what if Baruch and Jeremiah were still speaking? Or what else might be part of the story? Traditions love doing this, right? They love filling the gaps. They love, trying to add more to old stories. Additions to Daniel. The book of Daniel, when it's translated into Greek, includes 3 new stories. One of them, this prayer of Azariah and the Song of the 3 Jews. If you remember the book of Daniel, people are thrown into the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are in there. And so the question is, I wonder what they would have prayed while they were in there. Well, the translator or somebody said, here's what the prayer might have looked like. So here is a psalm. Susanna, here's another story about, well, I was going to say about a female hero. That's not exactly right. So Susanna is this, again, a beautiful woman, but also incredibly virtuous woman. And there are these two Jewish elders, who see her bathing. You might hear memories of David and Bathsheba. And they confront her, and they say, we're in love with you. Lie with us. And she says, I won't do that. I'm married. I'm virtuous. And they say, if you don't do this, we're going to tell everybody that we caught you with a young man. And she says, what am I going to do? She's like, I won't transgress my values, right? And so they bring her before a court, and on the basis of the testimony of these two elders, she's sentenced to death. And then we're told that God kind of sends God's spirit into Daniel, and Daniel stands up and he's like, I'm not going to be a part of any of this. And then Daniel kind of takes over the courtroom. It's this lovely legal drama. And he says, bring in the elders one at a time. And he says to the first one, what kind of tree were you sitting under when you saw what happened? And he names a kind of tree. And then they bring in the other elder. What kind of tree? And it's a different tree. And everybody's like, oh, Daniel's brilliant. So it's not so much about Susanna saving the day as it is Daniel's the only one who can think maybe the elders are lying. But it's this interesting story about virtue, but also about corrupt power. And it's a courtroom scene, which are going to be also really important in a lot of ancient literature as well. Bel and the Dragon. Oh, this is lovely. So I'm skipping Susanna. Oh, Susanna's also remembered really well in some art, both for her own self and her virtue, but then also just kind of the lecherous stares of others as well. This is a contemporary Israeli artist. The way in which she's objectified by these Jewish elders who are kind of above the law themselves in her story. Bel and the Dragon. Oh, all right. So in addition to Daniel, so Bel is this idol. If you remember the book of Daniel, when we talked about that, it's always a stupid king and really smart Daniel, or really faithful Daniel. But the kings are just idiots in all of these kind of courtroom scenes. And that's the case with Bel and the Dragon. So we'll read some of this. The Babylonians had an idol called Bel, and every day they provided for it 12 bushels of choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. These are the sacrifices they put out for this idol, this god made out of silver. The king revered it and went every day to worship it. But Daniel worshiped his own God. Remember, Daniel's not going to violate his principles. So the king said to him, why do you not worship Bel? He answered, because I do not revere idols made with hands, but the living God who created heaven and earth and has dominion over all living creatures. Here's something else that's changing. We saw a bit of this in the Older Testament, that Jews are moving from a belief that their God is the best of all possible gods to an understanding that their God is the only God, right? And so there's always this criticism of idolatry. Don't worship other gods. Don't worship other gods. And when you start to get closer to the time of Jesus is a criticism, not just don't worship other gods, but a criticism of other people's gods, saying, right, things that are made out of silver and gold are not true deities. If you know the book of Acts, when Paul is in Athens, he makes a similar kind of speech to the Athenians, right? These statues cannot be who God really is. So we see some of that coming out now in Daniel, where one of the reactions to the religious practices of other nations is, it's not that they worship different gods, they're worshiping false gods. You see how that's working itself out? Anyway, so Daniel says that to him. The king said to him, do you not think that Bel is a living God? Do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day? And Daniel laughed and said, don't be deceived, O king, for this thing is only clay inside and bronze outside and has never eaten or drunk anything. So the king was angry and called the priests of, that should be Bel, and said to them, if you do not tell me who is eating these provisions, you shall die. But if you prove that Bel is eating them, Daniel shall die, because he has spoken blasphemy. And so, of course, Daniel goes, because Daniel's smarter than everybody else in Babylon, and they bring in all of this food. And then before they shut the door, Daniel has people bring ash in and puts ash all over the floor of the temple. Then they shut the door and they seal it, like with wax, so nobody can get in. Because as Daniel suspects, the priests of Bel have dug a tunnel. And they come in with all the priests and all their families, and they eat everything. I don't know how they eat 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine, but they do that every night. And so, of course, the next day, they unseal the door, and they walk in, and the food's all gone, and the king's like, aha, see, I told you Bel was a god. Daniel, you're going to die. And Daniel says, look at the floor. And of course, there's footprints everywhere, and then the king kills the priests. So anyway, that kind of, a lot of moralistic stories here. The dragon, probably a serpent, not a dragon like on, Pete's Dragon or anything like that. And this is, again, the king worships this dragon. And then Daniel's like, I can kill this dragon without a sword or a club, which just seems amazing. And he feeds it these balls of like tar and hair and fat that apparently go into the serpent's belly and then expand and explode, and he kills. So a lot of these are fun kind of, what's the word I want? Folktale-ish kind of literature. But then you've got books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which tell the story of the Maccabean revolt. And if you don't know what this is, roughly around the year 180 BCE, before the Common Era, there's a Jewish revolt against Greek-speaking Syrians who run things. The temple is defiled by the Syrians, and then eventually, Jewish forces retake the temple and they rededicate the temple. So it's where where Hanukkah comes from in this story. That's talked about in 2nd Maccabees. So a lot of these books are stories about the war and the family that leads the revolt, the Maccabees. But it's also got stories about things like martyrdom, like it's better to die for your faith than to renounce your faith. And the reason behind that is because God will reward you in the afterlife. So we start to see now, again, this idea of there's going to be not just an afterlife, but a judgment day, right? And you're going to be judged based on your faithfulness. And so people in these books go willingly to their death in confidence. Like if, God might rescue me, but if not, God's going to raise me up. So again, we see that kind of thing developing in Judaism. These are, our Bibles in the back corner notwithstanding, these are all books you can find really easily on the web or anything like that if you want to read them. None of them are, what's the word I want? For the exception of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, none of them appear to be kind of serious retellings of histories. They're more folklore in general. And then the 2 books of wisdom, Wisdom of Solomon and the Wisdom of Son of Sirach. If you enjoyed wisdom literature, read these. They talk a lot about the ways in which God is manifest in the world through wisdom and through how people live. So what we see then are ways in which Jews are writing, at least with this kind of literature, in ways that tell history, in ways that make it exciting and show off what faith is supposed to look like. Some of that probably influences the way that the Gospels are written, and certainly the Acts of the Apostles are written. You see references in these books to afterlife questions and judgment questions. Obviously, those are important in the Newer Testament. You see references to demons and to angels, which, again, populate the Newer Testament much more than the Older Testament. So we do see these changes. Anyway, how do I want to close this? The Bible itself bears witness to change. Right? Changing ways of thinking, right? Changing ways of practicing one's faith, changing ways of understanding how God might prove to be faithful or how justice might show itself out. In many ways, the Bible sets us on a trajectory to expect that kind of life in a religious community, right? How do we respond to the trials? How do we respond to the challenges that face us in this given moment, right? What does it mean to be truly, for them, Jewish in this moment? We might ask, what does it mean for us to be truly Christian in this particular moment? Right? The Bible doesn't give all of the answers, but it sets us on this course to expecting those things. I talked way more today than I hoped I would, but I don't know, hopefully it was at least modestly interesting. A week from now, we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the diversity of Judaism. So this will be exciting. If you don't know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, you should come next Sunday. But this was a discovery in the late 1940s in a cave near the Dead Sea that tells us a lot about different kinds of Jewish communities. And this one was really sectarian and really strict, but it helps us understand the Judaism into which Jesus was born a lot better. Anyway, we're at time, so if you have to go, you can certainly go. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer those. We're probably done on the live stream. If not, it was great having you here, listening to me just ramble. Next time I'll try to cover less material. But thank you. And yeah, Kathleen, if you have questions, I'm happy to.